The Kelzari had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and they had never known defeat. Never felt the cold hand of fear wrap around their hearts. Never looked upon another species and wondered if perhaps they had made a terrible mistake. Their empire stretched across 300 star systems, and their ships moved through space like silver rain, and their soldiers marched with the confidence of a species that had crushed every enemy they had ever faced. The Kelzari were tall and elegant, with bodies that seemed to flow like water, their skin a deep purple that shimmered in the light, their eyes like pools of liquid gold that looked down upon lesser species with contempt and amusement. And now they held human prisoners in their fortress on Varth Prime, a world that had never fallen to any enemy, a world protected by shields that could stop 1,000 warships, a world with gates so massive and so strong that they had become legend across the galaxy. The United Earth Coalition sent their diplomats first because humans believed in words before weapons, believed that even the cruelest enemy might listen to reason. Ambassador Sarah Chun stood before the Kelzari High Council and spoke of peace and trade and the release of the 3,000 humans taken during the Boundary Wars. Humans who had been captured when their colony ships strayed too close to Kelzari space. High Archon Selthrex sat upon his throne of black obsidian, and he listened to the human ambassador with a smile that showed too many teeth. He found her amusing, this small creature from a small world, this representative of a species that had only traveled among the stars for 200 years. "Your people belong to us now," he said, his voice like grinding stone. "They will serve the Dominion until their bodies fail, and then we will find new uses for them. Go back to your little world and tell your leaders that the Kelzari do not negotiate with insects." The ambassador returned to Earth with those words burning in her heart, and the Coalition Assembly met in emergency session. The admirals spoke of war, but their voices carried doubt, because how could humanity challenge an empire that had never been defeated? How could their young fleet break through defenses that had held for thousands of years? It was then that Commander Marcus Cole stepped forward and asked to speak. He was 43 years old, with gray streaking through his dark hair and scars that told the story of 20 years of service. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they held a weight that made younger soldiers look away, a weight born from battles fought and friends buried and a daughter stolen. "The shields around Varth Prime cannot be broken by our weapons," he said, his voice steady and calm. "Our fleet cannot breach their orbital defenses, and our missiles cannot scratch their walls. But I have read the intelligence reports, and I have found something the Kelzari have forgotten." The assembly listened as Marcus explained what he had discovered. The great gates of the central fortress were not protected by energy shields because they were built in an ancient time, built as monuments to Kelzari tradition, built from physical materials that the Kelzari believed no force could ever break. "Give me 16 soldiers and 1 shuttle," Marcus said. "We will land on the surface, and we will reach those gates, and we will open them from the inside. When the gates fall, your fleet can pour through the breach." Admiral Zhang shook her head slowly, and her voice was heavy with sorrow. "Commander, you are describing a suicide mission. Even if you survive the landing, even if you cross hundreds of kilometers of enemy territory, even if you reach those gates, how will 16 soldiers open doors that have been sealed for 3,000 years? Marcus thought of his daughter Elena, just 11 years old when the Kelzari took her, now 17 and suffering in their prison camps. He thought of her smile and her laugh, and the way she used to fall asleep on his shoulder during long shuttle rides. "I will find a way," he said, and something in his voice made the admirals believe him. The volunteers came forward without hesitation. Rodriguez was a demolitions expert who had lost her brother to the Kelzari. Chun was a medic who had sworn an oath to save lives and was willing to risk his own. Okonkwo was a sniper who could hit a target from 3 kilometers away. Petrov was an engineer who could build or break anything with equal skill. 16 soldiers gathered in the shuttle bay of the carrier Defiance, and they looked at each other with eyes that held no illusions. They knew the odds. They knew that most of them would never see Earth again, but they also knew that 3,000 of their people were waiting to be saved. Marcus stood before his team, and he did not give them a speech about glory or honor or the righteousness of their cause. Instead, he simply said, "I will not lie to you. This mission will be the hardest thing any of us has ever done. Some of us will not come back. But somewhere on that world, there are mothers and fathers and children who are praying that someone will come for them. We are the answer to those prayers." The shuttle launched at midnight Earth time, and it screamed through space toward the distant fortress world. Inside, 16 soldiers checked their weapons and their armor and their courage, and they thought about the people they were fighting for. Marcus sat apart from the others, and he held a small photograph in his hands, a picture of a little girl with her father's eyes and her mother's smile. Elena had been gone for 6 years, but he had never stopped searching for her, never stopped believing that one day he would hold her again. The Kelzari had taken so much from so many people, and they had never paid any price for their cruelty. They sat in their fortress, and they laughed at the suffering of others, and they believed that nothing could ever threaten their power. They were wrong, because humanity was coming, and humanity did not know how to give up, did not know how to accept defeat, did not know how to stop fighting when the people they loved were in danger. The shuttle entered Kelzari space, and alarms began to sound across the fortress world. Defense systems activated and patrol ships launched, and soldiers rushed to their positions because something was approaching, something small and fast and completely insane. Hyarchon Selthrex received the report, and he laughed until tears streamed from his golden eyes. One shuttle, 16 humans, against the greatest fortress in the galaxy. "Let them come," he said, still laughing. "Let them throw themselves against our walls. It will be a fine entertainment before dinner." He would not be laughing for much longer. The shuttle came down through fire and thunder as defense turrets tore the sky apart with beams of burning light. Pilot Jackson fought the controls with everything she had, weaving between explosions, diving through clouds of smoke, screaming at her passengers to hold on. A beam struck the left engine, and the shuttle spun wildly out of control. Marcus grabbed the safety harness as the world became a blur of metal and flame, and he could hear soldiers shouting as they were thrown against the walls like toys in the hands of an angry child. They hit the ground hard, so hard that the shuttle broke apart around them, scattering pieces of metal and equipment across a jungle that glowed with strange colors. Marcus pulled himself from the wreckage, and his head was ringing, and his vision was blurred, but he forced himself to stand because there was no time for weakness. "Sound off," he shouted into the smoky air, and voices came back to him one by one. Rodriguez was alive, Chun was alive, Okonkwo and Petrov were alive. But Pilot Jackson would never fly again, and neither would 4 others who had not survived the crash. 9 soldiers stood among the burning remains of their shuttle, and they looked at the alien jungle around them, with eyes that held grief but no surrender. They had lost friends, but they could not stop to mourn because every second they stayed in one place was a second the enemy could use to find them. A place was a second the enemy could use to find them. "The fortress is 200 kilometers north," Marcus said, checking his damaged navigation device. "We move fast, we stay quiet, and we do not stop until we reach those gates." The jungle of Varth Prime was like nothing any of them had ever seen. Trees that reached 100 meters into the purple sky, plants that glowed with inner light, creatures that watched from the shadows with too many eyes. The Kelzari had shaped this world to their needs, and they had filled it with nightmares. But the humans moved through it like ghosts, using skills learned in 100 training exercises and a dozen real battles. They crossed rivers that burned with strange chemicals, and they climbed mountains. That seemed to reach for the stars, and they never complained. Never asked for rest, never showed the fear that lived in their hearts. On the second day, the drones found them. Silver machines came screaming through the trees, firing weapons that turned everything they touched into ash. Rodriguez pushed Marcus down behind a rock, and she stood up with her launcher on her shoulder, and she fired 3 times before a beam caught her in the chest. "Oh!" she shouted as she fell. "I will hold them here. Go and save those people. Go." Marcus wanted to stay, wanted to fight beside her, but Chum grabbed his arm and pulled him away. They ran as explosions echoed behind them, and when the sound finally stopped, they knew that Rodriguez was gone. 8 soldiers now, and the fortress was still so far away. They found a cave that night, and they rested for a few precious hours. Marcus sat at the entrance, and he watched the alien stars wheel across the sky, and he thought about Rodriguez and her brother, and how she had joined this mission for revenge but had died for something better. "Commander," Chum said softly, sitting beside him, "how do you keep going? How do you carry all this weight?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment before he answered. "I think about the people waiting for us. I think about my daughter and all the others in those camps. I think about how they must feel, wondering if anyone is coming, wondering if they have been forgotten. I keep going because they need me to keep going." Chum nodded slowly, and he looked up at the stars. "Then we will keep going with you." The third day brought the Kelzari death squads, elite soldiers in black armor who moved through the jungle like shadows. They were faster than humans, and they could see in the dark, and their weapons never seemed to miss. Okonkwo and her spotter Thompson set up on a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. They could see the death squad approaching, 30 Kelzari soldiers hunting for the humans who dared to invade their world. "We will hold them here," Okonkwo said into her radio, her voice calm and steady. "The rest of you go around through the eastern pass. We will buy you time." Marcus wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. Someone had to hold the enemy back, and Okonkwo was the best shot among them, capable of turning that valley into a death trap for anyone who tried to cross. For 11 hours she held that ridge, firing shot after shot, taking down Kelzari soldiers until they learned to fear the crack of her rifle. When her ammunition finally ran out, she drew her knife and she charged down the hill to meet them face to face. 6 soldiers left, and the fortress was growing closer. On the 4th day, they reached the River of Burning Glass, a waterway that flowed with liquid that sparkled like diamonds and dissolved anything organic that touched it. There was only one bridge, and it was guarded by a small army of Kelzari troops. Petrov studied the enemy position, and he saw something that made him smile. A fuel depot sitting right next to the bridge, filled with enough energy to light up the whole valley. "I can set a charge that will blow that depot sky high," he said. "The explosion will take out the bridge guards, and you can cross before reinforcements arrive." "And what about you?" Marcus asked, already knowing the answer. Petrov shrugged, and his smile did not waver. "Someone has to trigger the charge manually. The remote detonators are broken. I will stay behind and make sure it works." The explosion was visible for 50 kilometers, and it shook the ground like an earthquake. Marcus and the others ran across the damaged bridge as flames reached for the sky, and behind them Petrov became a legend. 4 soldiers now, then 3 when Williams fell to a sniper. Then 2 when Chum stayed behind to treat wounded civilians they found hiding in a cave. Civilians who would have died without his help. On the 6th day, Marcus Cole walked alone toward the gates of the central fortress. His armor was cracked and broken, held together by tape and willpower. His weapons were empty, abandoned somewhere in the jungle when they became too heavy to carry. His left arm hung at his side, shattered by a fall on the 3rd day, and every step sent waves of pain through his body. But he did not stop, could not stop, would not stop. Because somewhere behind those gates, his daughter was waiting, And he had made a promise 6 years ago that he would find her no matter what it took. The Kelzari commander watched him approach on the security screens, and he could not believe what he was seeing. One human, broken and alone, walking toward gates that had never been breached. "Surrender, human," the commander broadcast across all frequencies. "Your species' defiance ends here." Marcus looked up at the gates, 40 meters of alloyed metal that had stood for 3,000 years, and he did not answer with words. The gates of the central fortress rose before Marcus like the walls of a metal mountain, stretching 40 meters into the purple sky, so wide that 100 soldiers could march through them side by side. They were made from titanium alloy, the strongest material the Kelzari had ever created, and they had not been opened by force in 3,000 years. 73 security cameras recorded what happened next, capturing every moment from every angle, and those recordings would change the galaxy forever. Marcus walked forward slowly, his boots leaving bloody footprints on the stone ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps that spoke of pain and exhaustion. The Kelzari guards on the walls watched him with confusion, because surely this broken creature was not a threat. Surely he had come to surrender. Surely no being could be foolish enough to challenge the unbreakable gates. One guard laughed and pointed down at the human. "Look at it," he called to his companions. "It can barely stand. Should we shoot it or wait to see what it does?" "Let it touch the gates," another guard replied with amusement. "Let it see how hopeless its situation is. Then we will take it to the prison camps with the other humans." Marcus reached the gates, and he stood there for a moment, just breathing, just existing, feeling the cold metal against the skin of his unbroken hand. He thought about Rodriguez and Okonkwo and Petrov and all the others who had died to bring him here, and he felt their sacrifices burning inside him like a fire that could never be put out. He thought about his daughter Elena, somewhere behind these gates, waiting in darkness for a rescue that the Kelzari believed would never come. He remembered the day she was born, the first time she had called him daddy, the way she used to run into his arms when he came home from missions. He thought about the 3,000 humans trapped on this world, men and women and children who had done nothing wrong except exist in a universe that contained the Kelzari. They had suffered for years, and they had lost hope, and they needed someone to show them that they had not been forgotten. And Marcus Cole decided that these gates would fall. The Kelzari did not understand humans because they had never needed to understand them. Humans were small and weak, and came from a world that the Kelzari considered unremarkable, a planet called Earth that was nothing special in their vast empire. But Earth was special in ways the Kelzari had never considered. Earth was a world of crushing gravity, a planet that pressed down on everything that lived upon it with a force that the Kelzari could barely imagine. Humans had evolved under that weight, had grown strong bones and dense muscles, had developed bodies that were built to endure constant pressure. Marcus had trained in the Coalition's augmentation program, a brutal regime that pushed human bodies beyond their natural limits. He had spent years building strength that normal humans could only dream of, developing muscles that could lift weights that would crush ordinary men. But more than that, more than the physical strength, Marcus carried something the Kelzari could not measure with their instruments. He carried love and loss and rage and determination, emotions that burned hotter than any star. He pressed both hands against the gates, ignoring the screaming pain from his broken arm, and he pushed. The guards on the walls stopped laughing. The metal groaned, a sound that had not been heard in 3,000 years, a sound that echoed across the fortress like the cry of a wounded animal. The gates that had stood against armies were feeling pressure they had never been designed to withstand. "That is impossible," the Kelzari commander whispered, watching on his screen. "Nothing can move those gates." But Marcus was not nothing. He was a father who had lost his child, a soldier who had lost his team, a human who had been told his whole life that he was small and weak and insignificant. He was tired of being told what was impossible. His muscles burned and his bones ached, and blood ran from his nose and ears, but he did not stop. He found the seam between the two massive doors, and he dug his fingers into that tiny gap, and he pulled with everything he had left. The servos behind the gates were designed to move mountains, mechanical systems that used enough power to light a city, and they fought against this single human body with all their strength. They lost. With a sound like the universe itself was tearing apart, the gates began to move. Metal screamed as ancient mechanisms broke under pressure they had never been designed to handle. Alarms shrieked across the fortress as sensors reported the impossible. Marcus screamed too, not in pain but in pure rage, a sound that came from somewhere deeper than his throat, a sound that seemed to carry the voices of all the soldiers who had died to bring him here. The gates tore open. Light poured through the breach as Marcus stood in the opening, his silhouette black against the fires that had begun to spread through the fortress. He was broken and bleeding and barely able to stand, but he had done what the galaxy believed could not be done. The Kelzari guards opened fire in panic, beams of energy screaming toward the human who had shattered their world. But in the sky above, coalition ships were already descending, pouring through the gap in the planetary defenses that the open gates had created. Marcus fell to his knees as the first human soldiers rushed past him into the fortress. He had no strength left, nothing remaining except the knowledge that he had kept his promise. "Find the prisoners," he whispered to a young lieutenant who stopped beside him. "Find my daughter." The battle for Vorath Prime had begun, but the battle for the gates was already over. One human had done what armies could not, had broken what could not be broken, had proven that the Kelzari were not gods and their fortress was not invincible. Archon Selthrex watched the chaos spreading through his fortress, and he felt something he had never experienced before, an emotion that his species had forgotten over 12,000 years of dominance. He felt fear, because if one human could break gates that had stood for 3,000 years, what else might these creatures be capable of? What other impossible things might they achieve if they were pushed hard enough? The Archon had laughed at humanity just days ago, had called them insects, had believed they were nothing more than pests to be crushed and forgotten. He was not laughing anymore. On the walls of the fortress, the guards who had mocked Marcus Cole stood in stunned silence, trying to understand what they had witnessed. Their weapons hung forgotten in their hands as they watched the human ships descend from the sky. One of them finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "What are they?" No one had an answer. But across the galaxy, billions of beings were about to learn the truth about humanity, a truth that would change everything they believed about their universe and their place in it. The human had broken the fortress gate with his hands, and nothing would ever be the same again. The Battle of Vorath Prime lasted 7 hours, the shortest siege in galactic history for a world that had never fallen before. Coalition soldiers poured through the broken gates, and they swept through the fortress like a flood, freeing prisoners and capturing Kelzari commanders and tearing down the symbols of an empire that had believed itself eternal. But it was not the battle that changed the galaxy. It was the footage. Within hours of the gates falling, the security recordings had escaped Kelzari control and begun spreading across every communication network in known space. Someone had uploaded them to the Galactic Information Web, and they spread like fire through dry grass, copied and shared billions of times. Every species in the galaxy watched the same images. A broken human walking toward gates that had never been breached, pressing his hands against metal that had stood for 3,000 years, and then doing the impossible. The Ethoni were a species of artists and philosophers who floated through their crystal cities on worlds of eternal twilight. They had always believed that beauty and wisdom were the highest achievements of intelligent life. That physical strength was a primitive thing best left to lesser species. Elder Yellen watched the footage in her tower, and she felt her understanding of the universe shift beneath her. "They are not what we thought," she said to her council. "They are not fragile or weak. There is something inside them that we do not have, something that allows them to do things that should not be possible." The Vrextai were a hive-minded species who had fought the Kelzari for millennia without ever achieving victory. They communicated through chemical signals and shared thoughts, and when they saw the footage, every individual in their vast collective felt the same emotion at the same moment. "The enemy of our enemy has broken the unbreakable," the high voice announced. "Perhaps these humans could be useful allies. Or perhaps they are something we should fear even more than the Kelzari." The synthesists were ancient beings who had uploaded their minds into machine bodies thousands of years ago. They believed that organic life was merely a stepping stone to mechanical perfection, that flesh and blood were weaknesses to be overcome. But watching a human tear open gates that their calculations said could not be torn open, watching organic muscle overpower mechanical servos, they began to question everything they believed. "Our models are wrong," the prime processor admitted. "We assumed organic beings had hard limits that could be calculated. But this human exceeded those limits by a factor we cannot explain. There are variables we have not accounted for." The footage spread to 100 species, and each one reacted differently, but they all shared one common response. They had all underestimated humanity, and now they had to reconsider everything they thought they knew. The Kelzari had a word in their ancient language, Versharek, that meant the thing that cannot be stopped. It was a concept from their primitive past, a nightmare monster that existed only in legends, a force of nature that destroyed everything in its path. Now, that word had a face, a human face, the face of Marcus Cole. Within days, Marcus was entered into the Galactic Threat Registry, a list that had previously been reserved for rogue artificial intelligences and dangerous stellar phenomena. He was the first organic individual ever classified as a galaxy-level threat. On Earth, the news was received very differently. People danced in the streets when they heard that Varth Prime had fallen. They cheered when they learned that 3,000 prisoners were coming home. And they spoke the name Marcus Cole with pride and wonder and hope. He became a hero overnight, his face appearing on screens and posters and monuments. Children played games where they pretended to break fortress gates, and parents told their kids that they could do anything if they never gave up. But in the dark spaces between stars, other species told different stories. "The humans are coming," Kelzari mothers whispered to their children. "If you do not behave, the Versharek will come for you. Do not provoke the humans," Ithoni elders warned their young ones. "They do not know when to stop. They do not know when to accept defeat. They are dangerous in ways we cannot predict. Humanity should never have been allowed to leave their world," a Vrextai commander declared. "They are not like other species. They are something else, something that does not belong among civilized beings." The footage was analyzed by scientists and military strategists across the galaxy. They studied every frame, measured every movement, tried to understand how a single human could do what armies could not. Some concluded that Marcus Cole was an exception, a freak of nature, a one-in-a-billion individual who did not represent his species. They told themselves that most humans were weak, that the threat was limited, that there was no reason to fear. But others looked deeper, and they saw a more terrifying truth. They saw that humans had evolved on a world of crushing gravity, that their bodies were designed for endurance and strength that other species could not match. They saw that humans had a history of doing impossible things, of climbing mountains and crossing oceans and surviving disasters that should have wiped them out. They saw that humans were driven by emotions that other species did not fully understand, bonds of love and loyalty that could push them beyond all reasonable limits. And they realized that Marcus Cole was not an exception. He was a sample, a preview of what humanity was truly capable of when pushed to the edge. If one human can do this, a synthesis analyst calculated, what could 1,000 humans do? What could 1,000,000? What happens when we face an entire species of beings who refuse to accept the word impossible? No one had an answer to that question. 3 species immediately sent ambassadors to Earth, seeking alliance with humanity. 9 others retreated beyond the outer rim, deciding that they wanted to be as far from these strange creatures as possible. The Kelzari Dominion itself began to fracture as regional governors fought for power in worlds that had been conquered thousands of years ago saw their chance for freedom. And throughout the galaxy, in 100 different languages, the beings spoke the name that had become synonymous with terror and wonder and the terrifying potential of the human species. Marcus Cole, the human who broke the unbreakable gates. Marcus Cole, the Vershuruk. Marcus Cole, the proof that humanity was something the galaxy had never seen before and might never understand. The footage continued to spread, and the stories continued to grow. And in the quiet spaces between the stars, ancient powers began to wake and wonder if perhaps they should have paid more attention to that small blue world called Earth. 6 months had passed since the gates of Varth Prime fell, and Marcus Cole sat in a hospital room on Luna, watching the blue and white sphere of Earth rise slowly outside his window. He had watched that same sight 1,000 times since they brought him here, and each time it reminded him why he had fought. His body had been rebuilt by the best doctors in the Coalition. Synthetic bones now replaced the ones he had shattered. Cloned muscle had been grafted over tissue that had torn itself apart. And nanomachines flowed through his blood, repairing damage that would have killed any ordinary person. But some wounds could not be healed by medicine. He still woke in the night hearing the screams of his soldiers, still saw their faces when he closed his eyes, still felt the weight of their sacrifices pressing down on him like the gravity of 1,000 worlds. Rodriguez, who had died holding off drones so the others could escape. Okonkwo, who had held a ridge for 11 hours with nothing but a rifle and courage. Petrov, who had smiled as he triggered the explosion that bought them time. Chun, who had stayed behind to save civilians he had never met. They called Marcus a hero, but he knew the truth. He was alive because better people had died for him. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts, and his heart began to race as it had raced every day for the past 6 months. The door opened and Elena walked in, his daughter, 17 years old now, with eyes that held shadows they should not hold. "Hi, Dad," she said softly, and those 2 words meant more to Marcus than all the medals they had given him. She crossed the room and sat beside his bed, and they looked at each other in silence. There was so much to say and no way to say it. So many years lost that could never be recovered. So much pain that words could not touch. "I knew you would come," Elena finally whispered. "The whole time I was in that place, I knew you would find me." The other prisoners said I was foolish, said no one was coming, but I never stopped believing. Marcus felt tears running down his face, and he did not try to hide them. "I would have torn apart the whole galaxy to find you. Nothing could have stopped me." She took his hand gently, and she smiled through her own tears. "I know, Dad." I watched the footage. The whole galaxy watched. They talked for hours, sharing stories of the years they had been apart. Elena told him about the prison camp, about the cruelty of the guards and the kindness of the other prisoners, about how she had survived by holding on to hope, even when hope seemed impossible. Marcus told her about the mission, about the soldiers who had died, about the moment he stood before those gates and decided that nothing in the universe would stop him from reaching her. When she finally left to rest, Marcus sat alone again, and he thought about what he had become. The galaxy called him Vershuruk now, the thing that cannot be stopped. Children on alien worlds feared his name, and warriors on 100 planets studied the footage of his impossible feat. He had never wanted to be a monster. A chime at his door announced another visitor, and Marcus looked up to see Ambassador Yellen of the Ethony gliding into the room. Her body was like woven light, constantly shifting, and her voice was like wind through crystal. "Commander Cole," she said, settling into a form that could sit in the chair beside his bed. "I have come to speak with you, if you are willing." Marcus nodded slowly and waited. The Ethony had been among the first to seek alliance with humanity after Varth Prime, and he wondered what this ancient being wanted from him. "Your people frighten us," Yellen said, and her voice held no accusation, only truth, "not because of what you did. Many species have shown great strength in moments of crisis. What frightens us is what your actions revealed about your nature." "And what is that?" Marcus asked. "You do not know when to stop," Yellen replied. "You do not know when to accept defeat. You do not know when to die. Other species have limits, boundaries they will not cross, pain they will not endure. But you humans seem to lack these boundaries entirely." Marcus thought about her words, and he could not deny their truth. He had pushed himself beyond every limit he had ever known, had done things that his body was not designed to do, had refused to stop even when every part of him begged for rest. "That is not strength," he said quietly. "That is just being human." Yellen studied him for a long moment, and something like understanding flickered in her shifting features. "Yes," she finally said, "that is precisely what terrifies us. Your nature is not something you chose or earned. It is simply what you are. And we do not know how to prepare for beings who are built to exceed every limit." She rose to leave but paused at the door. "The galaxy will never see humanity the same way again, Commander. You have shown them something they cannot forget. Whether that is a gift or a curse remains to be seen." After she left, Marcus turned back to the window and watched Earth continue its slow rise. He thought about his daughter sleeping somewhere in this hospital, safe for the first time in years, and he knew he would do it all again without hesitation. But he also thought about the fear in Ambassador Yellen's voice and the way the galaxy now looked at humanity. He had broken more than the gates of Varth Prime that day. He had broken something else, some fragile balance that had kept the galaxy at peace. Now humanity was known not for its art or its science or its dreams, but for its capacity for impossible violence. They were the species that could not be stopped, the species that would tear apart anything that stood between them and the people they loved. Was that a good thing or a terrible thing? Marcus did not know. But as he watched the stars beginning to appear in the dark sky around Earth, he understood one simple truth. Humanity had announced itself to the universe in the only language that every species understood: force. And the galaxy would never forget the name of the human who broke the unbreakable gates. The father who crossed the stars to save his daughter. The soldier who proved that some things are stronger than metal and machines and the arrogance of ancient empires. His name was Marcus Cole, and the galaxy had learned it in fear. But Elena called him Dad, and that was the only name that mattered.